Well, hello, my name's Pete Falloon and I am the science lead for food security at the Met Office. I also work at the University of Bristol in the School of Biology, and I'm a sustainability director of Food Drink Devon, a local food business member organisation. And today I'm going to talk to you for about half an hour about the impact of climate change and climate extreme events on the UK agri-food system, and particularly think about how we might build resilience in UK agri-food through adaptation in agriculture and the wider food system. So in outline, I'll give a short introduction. I'm going to talk then about the changes in weather and climate that we're likely to experience in the future in the UK. And then I'll move on to think about the impacts of those changes in weather and climate on agriculture and food, and how we might respond in terms of building resilience. So to give you some headline messages from our latest climate projections produced by something called UKCP 18, the UK climate projections in the UK, really we're looking here at sort of the middle of the century, late end of the century projections. But the headline messages for what we'd expect for the future compared to the present day would be for warmer, wetter winters and hotter and drier summers overall compared to the present day. And along with that, we'd expect an increase in the severity, the duration in some cases, and the occurrence of extreme weather events. So more high temperature events, more heat waves, more heavy rainfall events, and longer periods of low rainfall and drought. To go into these projections in a little bit more detail, these maps show projected changes from UKCP, the UK climate projections, for the 2070s compared to the present day. And they are looking at a high emissions scenario, so a relatively, if you like, a relatively high climate change scenario. These particular figures are looking at the change in annual average temperature, so not the absolute values. And as you'll see here, we have three maps of change. The reason for that is that UKCP, in this case, provides 12 regional climate projections using very slightly different climate models that give us a sense of our confidence and the uncertainty in the results that we might expect under any one emission scenario. So here on the screen, moving from left to right, we have the projection which shows the lowest UK average temperature change as a whole through the average, or the central, as we call it, the average temperature change for the UK as a whole. And then on the right hand side, the projection, the model that has the highest UK average temperature change overall. So it gives us a sense of the spread of what we might be talking about under high emissions. Just a couple of points to highlight here really. Firstly, we see more annual warming in the south and the east of the country. And under the worst case scenario, if you like, we might be looking in those regions something like 6 degrees of annual warming by the 2070s. Less warming, of course, further north and further west, as we see on the maps. But if we're looking at one of the low end projections under this high emission scenario, then the warming might be more like 3-4 degrees in the south of the UK. So just to give you a sense of the kind of figures that we might be looking at. And in the same way, these two figures show results from UKCP climate projections. Again, the 2070s, the high emissions scenario. But in this case, it's looking at the percentage change in seasonal average precipitation for the 2070s. So on the left-hand side, winter, on the right-hand side for summer. And the brown and tan colours, the darker they get, the more drying there is compared to present conditions, whereas the darker blue turquoise colour, the darker they get, then the wetter conditions are likely to be compared to the present day. So what we see here in a similar way is that the winter wetting we see tends to be strongest in the north and the west of the UK, whereas the summer drying we're likely to experience tends to be strongest in the south and to some extent the east of the UK. In terms of the winter, in the north and the west, we might be looking at sort of around 20–30% increases in winter rainfall. In the summer, the biggest increases down in the south there might be around the 40–50% mark. So just to give you a sense of what those longer term and average projections might look like. We also, though, need to think about climate change overseas, because the UK imports roughly half the food we consume, but also because of the importance of things like feed imports for agriculture. And the figures here are taken from the IPCC report looking at global models. These particular plots are looking at changes at 2 degrees of average global warming. So that is the Paris Agreement higher target, if you like, there, compared to the pre-industrial period. On the left-hand side, the change in annual average temperature change. On the right-hand side, the annual rainfall changes. So they're both annual, not looking seasonally in this case. And I'll just point out here a few of these differences to highlight really how different climate changes might be in different parts of the world. So you can see on the left-hand side, bigger temperature changes in the high latitudes and further north, bigger warming, greater warming on land compared to over the oceans. On the right-hand side, much more mixed pictures of annual rainfall changes. And the ones I'd like to draw out here are areas where the UK, for example, sources lots of fruit and vegetables. For example, particularly during the winter, Southern Europe, parts of Northern Africa, parts of South America and South Africa. And those regions are projected in future to experience quite significant drying, which could put pressure on production. But also those regions experience significant present day hazards. So this is adding to the stress to those regions. So just the picture there that actually variable changes in climate in different regions of the world, and what that might do, I'll come back to this a little bit later. It might also alter the relative competitive advantage of growing different foods, producing different foods in different regions of the world compared to how the picture looks now, if you like. So I'd like to talk to you most of the rest of the talk about work we've been doing over the last 9 years or so for DEFRA. It's what we call a climate service, so we work very closely with DEFRA in understanding what they need in supporting policy with sound and robust scientific evidence. It's not just fundamental research and development and science. Very much the focus here is around agriculture and food. Our work is done largely in-house within the Met Office, but we have a growing strand of work where we work with academic partners and research institutes, bringing in great expertise in agriculture and food into the questions that we're asking. Really, the aim of what we're doing, as I said before, is to support and build up the science evidence in areas where there are gaps for policy making. So the idea, starting at the top of this figure, is to draw on those UK climate projections I've just shown and to try and make them more relevant, try and make them more useful for adaptation policy making in the UK, but also to support decision making in the broader industry. So can we take those changes in temperature and rainfall and make them more relevant to agriculture and food decision making? All of this is really, in the sense of the work we're doing for DEFRA, feeding into 2 different policy aspects. The first, in the middle, in the red, is the UK's climate adaptation policy cycle. This is part of UK law set into law by the Climate Change Act, and we have a 5-yearly climate adaptation policy cycle. So every 5 years there is a new climate risk assessment, a new national climate adaptation programme, and various aspects of that policy cycle. Underneath the timeline there are the actions that the Climate Change Committee undertakes, working with the academic and the scientific community in the UK, so to provide independent advice, independent climate risk assessments, to look at progress in adaptation, to make comments on the plans for adaptation. And on the top of the timeline, the government then uses this and builds on the work of the Climate Change Committee, the independent reports, to produce official government climate risk assessments and to feed into the official national adaptation programme and to report back on it. So this is redone every 5 years. In 2022, we produced the third climate change risk assessment. We're now working on the fourth. I will show shortly some of the work that's been done for the third cycle. We're also feeding into the bottom part there the UK Food Security Report, which is also required by Act of Parliament to be produced roughly or at least every 3 years now. The most recent one was produced in 2021, and we are currently working on the 2024 version. This report looks at various dimensions of the UK food system, things like domestic production, overseas food supply, trade and supply chains, consumer level and household level impacts, and looks at statistics and trends and tries to assess where things have been going, where they might be going in the future. So that's really the basis of the work that I'm going to try to describe to you in the rest of the webinar today. So to set the scene really, and building on the earlier slide I've just shown, this infographic is taken from the third climate change risk assessment produced by the Climate Change Committee, the independent risk assessment in 2022. And it's looking at the risks, opportunities and benefits of further action in response to climate change for agriculture and food. I want to make a few points here really. The first of them is that, as you see from the text behind me, the risks and opportunities to agriculture and food are really quite broad, really quite wide-ranging, all the way from things like those changing seasonal patterns of temperature and rainfall impacting on soils and soil processes, sea level rise causing inundation and flooding of agricultural land, causing salt water to get into water storage and aquifers, risks and opportunities for productivity from extreme events and changing climate, the impacts of different pests, pathogens and non-native species in a new climate envelope, opportunities to grow new and different species, to bring in different production systems, which in turn will change landscape character, risks to food safety and security, both at home and overseas, given that strong import dimension, but also, as I mentioned on the global climate change projections slide, opportunities to either import or export food in the UK as the climate changes in different ways at home and overseas and changes the relative competitive advantage of producing food in different regions around the UK. The other thing I'd like to mention here really is what we call the urgency scores. So those are those sort of different coloured tags you see on the map on the figure there. And these look at what we need to be doing, the recommendations for the next 5 years ahead. So in 2022, you'll see for agriculture and food, lots of them were either red or orange. This meant that in the next 5 years, the CCC, the Climate Change Committee, felt we needed to be doing more, taking more action, actually adapting in practice and setting the plans in place and making them work, as well as the orange there, which shows that we actually need further evidence, further knowledge and understanding to support robust decision making and adaptation in practice in the next 5 years. The blue one, which doesn't feature for agriculture and food, is to sustain the current path of action. The green one is a longer term horizon scanning piece really, so we just need to keep a watching brief. It's not a 5-year immediate priority to do something right now. The other thing I've mentioned too, as well as the fact that there are risks and opportunities, this widespread of different nature of them and the different urgency scorings not shown here, is that the Climate Change Committee also looks at the impact or the severity level for each of these risks and opportunities. So they will also be rated high, medium or low in terms of where we see them for the coming years on different time horizons. Okay. So building on that and having thought about the fact there that climate extremes are likely to be important for the UK agri-food system, and indeed, as I'll mention on the slide that follows this one, that the Climate Change Committee has assessed impacts of future weather and climate extreme events to be one of the highest risk future shocks to the UK food system. In response to this, we've been working in the Met Office with our academic partnership of 8 UK universities, but also with UK funding bodies, UKRI, with DEFRA, with the Food Standards Agency and others to try and scope out and understand what changing weather and climate extreme events might mean all the way from farm to fork for the UK food system and food supply chain. I'm not going to go into the details of every one of them. I'll just give one detailed example and point out some of the other key pieces here. But if we take heat waves and hot extremes, how might high temperatures impact the UK food chain? And we can see impacts right the way from farm to fork, as well as high temperatures causing heat stress of crops, animals, and ultimately lower productivity and more variability in production. They can also cause heat stress and health impacts, of course, on those outdoor workforces. So in turn, that will cause greater variability filtering down through the supply chain. And in the middle of the supply chain there, transport and storage might also need to take on board more temperature control, more cold chain activities, refrigeration, keeping the products cool in high temperatures to make sure they remain healthy and safe. And then as we move through to retail and consumption, of course, consumers eat different foods in different weather. So in high temperatures, people veer towards barbecue food and strawberries and salads and things like that. In cooler weather, people want soup. So there will be not just the impacts of varying variability in supply filtering down from the impacts on production, but also changing demand patterns. And where we are storing and handling food at high room temp, high ambient and room temperatures, then potentially higher levels of food degradation and wastage and food safety concerns. So you can see there potentially quite systemic impacts, as well as things like low rainfall and drought, of course, having impacts at the production end by reducing productivity through water availability and plant growth and so on, water availability for animals. High rainfall and flooding. Again, one of the things we thought about was transport delays in the transport network. We mostly transport our food in the UK by road, of course. Wind and storm surge there, I'll just pick out the international aspects again, given that most of the food we import comes through ports, then the impact of storm surges and very high sea levels could be something to think about in terms of the resilience of imports and food. So just a brief overview of some of the kinds of impacts that extreme events might have right throughout the UK food supply chain and the food system. So what to me is the challenge in adapting to climate change in UK food security? I've already mentioned the importance, and we've talked a bit about it now, about the impacts of those extreme weather events on the UK food system. Some very new climate science by Lizzie Kendon and colleagues at the Met Office has shown, though, that at the same time, the evolution of future extreme events might be quite unpredictable. If we look at heavy rainfall events, we might see short periods where lots of new rainfall events are broken in the future, and then a big gap where we don't see any new rainfall records being broken, perhaps years, perhaps a decade or so. So lots of volatility and unpredictability to adapt to. And at the same time, the work the Climate Change Committee has been doing to assess recently progress in adaptation, how well are we doing in adapting as the UK and as different sectors to the changing climate, it's saying that actually we're not doing well enough. And this to me was brought home by one of the recent climate extreme events, the 2022 heat wave. We saw those 40-degree temperatures for the first time in the UK. The press reported millions of deaths of premature deaths of shed-housed chickens. So perhaps an example of a lack of preparedness, and something we can certainly do something together about. So what are we doing in that context to support greater resilience to climate change, to support adaptation, to support policy and the wider industry? I'm going to show 3 or 4 different examples of how we are taking those basic, if you like, those simple projections of future climate, the temperature, the rainfall changes I showed on the first few slides, to make them more relevant to decisions and policy in the UK agri-food space. The first of these is an example looking at arable crops and looking at heat stress to wheat. So we've been working there with DEFRA's Genetic Crop Improvement Network, and we asked them what kind of climate extreme events might matter in terms of how you might breed in resilience traits to make sure crops remain productive and high yielding in a future climate. One of the things they said was, well, heat stress events around this sensitive period called anthesis around flowering can have really big impacts. If we see high temperatures there, it can impact yield, it can impact grain quality. So we have taken the UK climate projections, we have looked at a specific period of the year, the first 2 weeks of June, looked at the present day and into the future. So this is currently when anthesis happens for UK wheat across much of the country. And we're looking here at 3 days seeing consecutively high temperatures above 25 degrees, trying to tease out how often do those events happen in terms of over a 10-year period. We can see on the left-hand side here, and also I should note the dots on the map show the agricultural, the arable and horticultural production regions. But we can see on the left-hand side in the present day, light blue, light yellow colours. These events occur only, say, once in every 10 years. By the time we move through to the right-hand side in the 2050s, some parts of the south and the east of the UK are seeing them occur nearly every other year. So a very significant uplift. And we hope that this information can help build relevant heat stress traits into future crops, supporting resilience, but also help target where we might need them most and how those characteristics might need to vary across the country. One of the other things we've been doing with this information is to try and look at how either the implications of changing climate on crop development or how practical adaptation measures might play into this picture. So this slide here is showing exactly the same information I showed on the last slide, but all that we have done is move the window of the year that we're looking at. So rather than the first 2 weeks of June, we're coming back a few weeks to the last 2 weeks of May, and again looking at those exactly same wheat heat stress events. And what we see here is that we largely avoid a significant amount of those heat stress events into the future. Why have we done this? Why am I showing this? Well, firstly, we know that in a warmer climate overall, crops are likely to develop faster. So we might see anthesis coming back and happening earlier in the year. So this might be a more realistic estimate. But equally, we might decide to plant crops earlier to take advantage of that and avoid heat stress, as we can see here. So different implications of the ways we might use this information to support adaptation. So just a couple of examples for arable there. I'm now going to show a very similar example for arable drought and one of the pieces of work we've been doing with ADAS. So they suggested that we look at 2-week drought periods, which could be important to agriculture. So 15 days where overall we see less than 0.2 millimetres of rainfall. And again, the dots show, the back dots show the agricultural, the arable and horticultural production regions. And we are looking at the number of drought events that we typically expect to experience in a year, both in the present day and into the future. And I'll just again say, you know, in the present day, these 2-week droughts don't really occur very much in the present day. By the time we get to the 2050s, the south and the east of the UK are perhaps seeing 20 or so, 25 of these events happen, you know, quite frequently into the future. So I'll now show a similar example for cattle heat stress. And this is looking at, again, work with ADAS, and it's looking at 3-day heat stress events using a combined measure of temperature and humidity, where we see something called the temperature humidity index greater than a value of 72, which is relevant to cattle, also relevant to sheep and poultry in a general way. And we know that both temperature and humidity can have impacts on the overall heat stress felt by the animal. Again, in a similar way, what we see here, we're looking at the number of events experienced, very few of these events in the present day, but we might be seeing 8 or 10 of these events occurring annually in the south and the east of the UK. So again, we hope that this can either inform the kind of cattle breeds that we might need to bring in, inform how we manage those animals, and where we need to prioritise making some of those changes. Final example here is taken from my colleague Freya Gary's work and is looking at potato blight. Similar in a way to the previous slide, it's plotted slightly differently. The risk of potato blight here is assessed by a combination of where we see high minimum temperatures, so nighttime temperatures above 10 degrees and relative humidity above 90%. So those two things are likely to lead to an elevated risk of potato blight. The left-hand side shows the present day absolute values of the numbers of days per year. The right-hand side shows the value for the 2060s and the changes on the right-hand side. So I'll just highlight there significant uplifts, increases in potato blight risks in the north and the west of the country. And in a similar way, we hope that providing this can help support decisions around where we might need blight-resistant varieties most, and the nature of the blight-resistant varieties that we might need to bring into agricultural systems. Okay, so building on all of that, we've also been working with ADAS to think about some of those practical adaptation measures that might be most effective in supporting resilience to the changing climate. These are just a few examples, and particularly picking on what we've defined as quick wins. So they are things which we felt were easy to do, relatively high effectiveness, and likely to be relatively low cost. They're taken from a long list of something like 150 different adaptation measures which ADAS had produced, and looking at different weather and climate hazards. I'm just drawing together a small range of these just to illustrate some of the big ones, really. And you can see on the left hand side for heat stress and drought, it might be things like changing the cropping cycle, changing varieties, lots in here about water management and irrigation, around when we harvest crops to avoid fires in combines and so on and so forth in the harvested crop. In grassland systems, having a broader and a more diverse mix of species to cope with those hot, dry conditions, deeper rooting species, and moving animals around at night when it's cooler. In converse, for flooding and wet conditions, again, lots about water management there, but on the other side, managing obviously the excess of water, containing runoff and drainage, building up soil organic matter and soil quality to hold on to water throughout the year, having a plan, a formalised written down plan for flooding, working with the vet to make sure vaccinations are up to speed, and having a plan again around what needs to be done during wet conditions, and making sure in a practical sense that there's still grazing in grassland systems available during those wet periods. So that's just a quick run through of some of the work we've been doing. There's lots more to come on that. So finally, just some concluding thoughts there. I hope I have highlighted that there are both risks and opportunities to UK food security and farming from the changing climate. We need to think, I hope, as I've underlined too, both domestically and overseas. We also need to think about the whole food system and the whole food chain, and not just parts of it, and building up the evidence to support decision making across that space. But critically, I think we also need to be thinking about several different dimensions together and not in isolation. We need to be thinking, yes, about how we adapt to climate change, how we remain resilient, but how does that interact with our goals for net zero and carbon emissions? How do those two things interact with any broader win-wins, trade-offs, downstream impacts on ecosystems, on biodiversity, on economics, and so on and so forth? So taking a broad brush view of some of these things where possible. Really critically though, going back to what the Climate Change Committee was saying about preparedness in UK agri-food, we all need to work together to support greater uptake, greater adoption of climate adaptation, and putting it into practice in farmers, farming communities and the wider industry, which needs an effective and ongoing dialogue and co-design of more effective solutions. Thank you.